Well, a few more join us, but I'm Dan Jarenko from Nashville with Tennessee Alliance for Progress, the main sponsor of our new Green Economy Compass Conference. Our other major sponsors are the Nashville Peace and Justice Center and the Wendland Cook Program for Religion, Labor, and Ecology. And then we have another 20-some really fine community organizations across the Southeast that are co-sponsoring the conference. Tonight's workshop is an extremely important one for us so we can learn how to capture federal stimulus funding for communities to help us grow quality green collar jobs. If you're not familiar with Zoom, I'm sure most of you are by this point, but if you're not, you have a view button at the top right corner of your screen. You can click on that and click speaker, and that will put the main speaker on the large screen. Everybody will be muted unless we unmute you to ask a question or something towards the end. But of course, we encourage you to use the chat to ask questions, to make comments, to share information, because this is a conference that we're all joined together to share important information. We will be recording, and if you don't want your picture beamed across the Southeast, you might want to stop your video, but otherwise we will be recording and sharing this with folks. One other comment, we're not just watchers, we're all going to be workers on this, and so we're learning how to do some important work. So I'm going to now turn it over to Alex Easdale, who will introduce himself and then facilitate our panel. So welcome, Alex.
Yeah, thank you, Daniel. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. Well, thank you. Welcome to the New Green Economy Compass Conference. This is, I believe, day 4. I think we started over the weekend. And I just want to say how great it's been to be able to, I'm in Eastern time, so to get in here at 1 o'clock and 7 o'clock as much as I've been able to this week. I was telling Daniel earlier, if he could maybe do this like for the rest of the year, but he gave me a nervous laugh, so I guess that's not going to happen. But this has been a great conference. We're happy to be sponsoring and supporting this. And obviously this panel on the federal stimulus and local implementation. So I just want to thank the Tennessee Alliance for Progress and all of you for being here. I am Alexander Easdale. I'm the Executive Director of the Southeast Climate and Energy Network. We're a network across the Southeastern US. We've been around since 2008, actually born as a project of the US Climate Action Network. And we have been a fully independent formal network since 2018. We have 63 members and growing in our region. And our vision is basically that we envision the Southeastern US as a leading region for just, equitable, and inclusive solutions to the climate crisis. We take the South very serious. I personally believe that the South has a tremendous amount of potential in leading, not only nationally, but globally. So I will very quickly introduce our 2 presenters. They're each going to give a presentation, and then we're going to open it up for Q&A. If you can, put your questions in the chat and I can read them out, or maybe we can just, have you ask them verbally, but, in the interest of time, I would say, please put them in the chat as you're listening to these presentations. So I'll go ahead and present our panelists, starting with Dr. Sara White, who is the Senior Advisor for Jobs and the Economy at the California's Governor's Office of Planning and Research, where she leads state efforts to map an equitable high road transition to carbon neutrality. She works at the intersection of labor, workforce, and climate policy. Dr. White served in Governor Jerry Brown's administration as the inaugural Director for Equity, Climate, and Jobs at the California Workforce Development Board, where she designed the High Road Training Partnership Initiative and the Equity Plus Job Quality Agenda that now anchors the state's jobs and climate vision. Wow. Before heading west, Dr. White spent a decade at the Center on Wisconsin Strategy and National Policy Center at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, working on economic inequality, decarbonization, and social change. A national expert on jobs and training in the low carbon economy. She holds a PhD from Columbia University and a bachelor's from Wesley College. What an impressive resume and background, Dr. White. Also, we have Molly Cripps. Molly oversees the Tennessee Department of Environment and Conservation at the Office of Energy Programs, which comprises two sections, the Governor-Designated State Energy Office and the State Facility Utility Management section. Molly is the administrative lead for Tennessee's Volkswagen Diesel Settlement, Environmental Mitigation Trust, allocation, and a member of the Executive Committee for the Drive Electric Tennessee Consortium. She serves as Governor's Lee's designee to the State Energy Policy Council and represents TDEC on the Energy Efficient Schools Council and various TVA information exchanges and working groups. Molly has served on the National Association of the State Energy Officials Board of Directors since 2014 and is currently serving as a treasurer of the Executive Committee. In addition to Molly's energy-related work, she serves as the department's compliance coordinator for internal audit and the director of operations for the Bureau of Environment, including emergency response efforts. Prior to joining the state in 2010, Molly spent several years practicing law in Tennessee with a focus on compliance and municipal liability defense. She holds a bachelor's in history and political science from the University of Tennessee and a Juris Doctor from Vanderbilt University Law School. This is a very, very impressive panel. I really would like to move out of the way here and call on Dr. Sara to start with her presentation, if that's possible.
There we go. Hi, everyone. I am so delighted to be here, and I'm so glad that you have all gathered together to join in this work. And it's really an exciting time for this work to be going forward. Again, I am both excited about the work ahead of us and fearful in some ways that we may make some of the mistakes that we made and learned from in the Obama administration when the first sort of round of green jobs activities came forth. And so I was asked to talk a little bit about what we learned in those days and how we can use that to launch ourselves into, forward, faster, better learning on some of those issues. So I will talk a little bit about that. I think I need to share my screen. So I am going to hang on while I pull up my slideshow. I think this is a little bit of a, okay. Okay. Does everyone see that? Do you see multiple screens or just a big, Alex, are we okay with this?
Multiple, a big and a small one.
That's
like you can see the next slide.
That's kind of unfortunate, isn't it? Well, how about that?
That works.
That works. Okay, sorry folks for the technical difficulties. So anyways, I want to talk a little bit about some of the lessons that we learned a decade ago and going forward from that until now, mainly about jobs, training, and decarbonization or carbon neutrality or the green future, however you want to talk about it. I will leave this up here so that, or this will be available to you so that if you want to contact me, my email is on here. I can also offer some resources to folks if that's useful later. But I was involved in the 2000s in some of the early conversations defining green jobs. It's funny to hear the title green collar jobs coming back. I remember in the early days with the Apollo Alliance and others where we were struggling to define what that meant. And we really spent a lot of time helping when I was working at the University of Wisconsin, helping states and federal policymakers figure out what we needed to do to put into action a lot of the ideas about green jobs and what that meant. So I've turned that into what I think are sort of 4 easy commandments for the new movement. And some of these will be really familiar to you. Some of them might even be upsetting to you. But the first one is there is no such thing as a green job. The second one is that you have to know your labor market. The third one is that you have to take the high road. And the fourth one is that we need together to plan for a just transition. So I'm going to talk about those 4 things and then really sort of quickly frame that up and then hopefully we can have a much broader freewheeling discussion to delve into that at anything that you find particularly interesting. So the first lesson is that there are no green jobs, right? I always used to use this slide because I think that early on, the call for green jobs, at least a decade ago, was based on this sort of imaginary idea that some almost magical Martian ship would show up from another planet that would save us all from the recession, that would deliver the promised green land. We promised a lot of jobs to people that didn't really exist yet, that hadn't been defined, and we didn't have the policy to create those jobs. And so we got into trouble with that. I'll talk a little bit more about that. What we do know, when I say there's no green jobs, all I mean is that the jobs we're talking about, and this is probably old hat to you by now, but is that first of all, we're talking primarily about existing jobs or new jobs that will have some green skills. We're talking about jobs across industries, right? We're talking about jobs across occupations. If we take, for an example, sometimes I like to use clean transportation. That's a big thing in California. And people think, oh, we're going to have EV jobs. But really what those jobs look like, if you think about it, they look like manufacturing, the manufacturing electric vehicles. They look like building charging stations, which is construction jobs. It looks like maintenance, which are auto techs with some skills to work on electric vehicles. It looks like in operations, it looks like truck drivers and bus drivers with the skills to run a complicated computer-driven electric vehicle. So these are very familiar jobs. There's not this new set of green jobs that we need to rush out and set up new training for. So I think that's important to keep in mind. The same is true in renewable energy. In fact, for the California, and I'm going to talk a little bit about California, but just know that I worked with many states on the East Coast, worked for a decade in the Midwest. So this isn't just crazy California ideas here. It works in many places. But in California, our climate change scoping plan looks at many sectors. We look at energy, we look at transportation, waste, water, agriculture, working lands, heavy industry, and across all of those sectors, we found that more than 50% of the jobs we're expecting, if we were to meet our really ambitious climate goals in California, 50% of those jobs or more are construction jobs, right? And that has benefits and challenges. So we can talk about those. But so it's not a new set of jobs largely. We also found, I mean, I think some of my favorite stories coming out of ERA were the creation of amazing green jobs, if you will, in hospitals, right? So environmental tech workers, who we know often as janitors, are people who saved hospitals' bottom lines incredible amounts by saving water, by saving waste, by saving electricity across hospitals and emergency rooms and commercial spaces. They were the most efficient of all of the green jobs deployed. And so I don't know about you, but I don't always think of environmental service workers in hospitals as the leading edge of the green jobs movement, but there they were. And it was incredible, and it's an incredible equity story, and we can talk more about that, especially since they also had a huge role to play in reducing infection rates, which here in the middle of a plague is also incredibly important to think about. So if you want to talk more about that story, there's a lot of great lessons in there. But let me just again say what happened that was not so lovely. So ERA poured a lot of money into states to set up training programs for green jobs, largely in renewable energy and energy efficiency. This turned out to be a real disservice to workers and communities who could least afford it because they were trained for jobs that didn't exist yet, because we didn't put the policies in place at a federal level or even a state level to create those jobs. So the dream of green jobs started with the idea that climate is not a jobs killer, and that's a really important lesson, and we have to keep making it over and over again, to my eternal astonishment. But it doesn't mean that the jobs are going to appear automatically, right? People did not find magical paths out of poverty. The green economy then got a black eye because there weren't enough jobs. And many of the jobs we did train people for were crappy dead-end jobs, right? And so the idea that green jobs are going to bring us a future, a lot of people do not believe that and will not believe that. And they shouldn't if we don't change the way that we talk about it and do it. So just there's a lot of lessons in there. I think the political lesson that I take away from that is what's so important to me is that I think all of us together, and especially our brothers and sisters in the environmental movement, tied the climate agenda to a jobs agenda. And that was really smart, except then more promises were made by people who had no idea how labor markets work. Right? And those promises were then broken because of the way that markets work. And so it set us back a decade. So let's not do that again. So I think that the really important thing is that across this movement with all of our allies, we have to know something about jobs and labor markets if we're going to talk about jobs, right? So, and this is really geeky stuff. So I'm going to tell you just a little bit about it so that you have a teeny bit of fluency, and then we'll go on to talk about sort of the bigger, more exciting things. So the thing is that labor markets follow rules just like energy markets. There is supply and demand. And demand, and I'm just going to say this quickly so that I can actually say a few words about it that won't seem like Greek. But demand in the labor market is jobs, right? It's investments in creating jobs. It is the employers who hire people. That's what we mean by demand. Supply is workers and the institutions who train workers. And we tend to start in this country, all of us, on the supply side. So when we see a challenge, when we see an equity challenge, when we see an economic challenge, we think, let's train people, let's get more education going, because we have a story in this country that education is the path to freedom, right? Education does a lot of great things, but this is not all true. We know that there are differential educational outcomes. So there are differential outcomes depending on your race and your gender. We also know that if you have training in an area that does not deliver a job to you and you don't have skills that you can use in the labor market, that does not pay off either. So we know that, we do know that when we think about the green economy, we do need to think about delivering equity on the supply side. And that means things like, do we have accessible training and education? Are we delivering classes on nights and weekends? Are they affordable? Do we do them in small chunks? Do they have stipends? Do people have childcare to attend? Do they have transportation money? Are we designing this for low-income working adults and not just for 18-year-olds, right? That was their earn while you learn. There's all kinds of things we can do on the supply side. But the thing is that none of that creates jobs, and the training is irrelevant if there aren't good jobs on the other end of it. So, except for a larger question of general education and critical thinking, which we can have a separate conversation about. But so as activists and as policymakers, I think that in every investment we make in infrastructure, which is coming, right? And by that, I mean in water, in agriculture, in transportation, in energy, in caregiving. If the pandemic has taught us nothing, is that we have a failing caring infrastructure. What do we think about our long-term care facilities? So there's all kinds of infrastructure that we need to build. And rather than saying, let's have training for those jobs we think are coming, let's make sure that any money the states invest, and hopefully the feds invest as well, is tied to some kind of labor standard, right? Let's not send it out and say, let's put a training program on everything. Let's send it out with a quality standard. That looks like things like wages and hours. It looks like labor laws. It looks like fair scheduling. It looks like paid time off, sick time, worker voice, autonomy, all kinds of things up and down the scale. This is harder to do in some places of the country than others, but it doesn't rely just on, as some will tell you, your union density. What it means is that there are better and worse employers in every region of the country, and we need to work with the best ones. So that's something that I'm going to say, and we make sure that wherever the public is spending some of its money, it's going towards good jobs, not just green jobs, right? So we have a lot of models on how to do that, and I'm happy to talk about that, nuts and bolts, if you're interested in that. But I think that the important thing is about how to position this work and how to talk about it. So I think in addition to practical, tactical things, we talk not about a Green New Deal, not about a green future, not even about green jobs. We talk about a high road future. There's a lot of writing and thinking on this, but for us, I think the important thing is that we aren't framing this work as anti-fossil fuel, as moving away from coal and oil and gas, although it is all of those things. We are working towards an economy that is equitable, that is sustainable, that is prosperous. The kind of language that you use in describing your network is perfect. It works for workers, it works for businesses, it works for communities. It is an economic development strategy that starts with jobs rather than starting with education. It engages people across all industries. Right? So I think the lesson in this coming out of ERA was that equity matters. If we have learned nothing in the last 2 years in this country, is that that we have to pay attention, not just to equity and economic inequality issues, but also in terms of racial justice. One of the things that struck me looking back on it is that the environmental justice community was largely left out of the green jobs conversations the first time around, and we cannot have that happen again. So just the way I frame it is just as we no longer will accept an economy that's based on environmental degradations, like of course we're going to look at, thinking about climate and environment and all of our job creation, we should no longer think about our future without thinking about workers and labor degradation, right? If we're going to build efficient, affordable housing, with poverty wages, like what does that say about the community we're creating for ourselves, right? And we can do that in every industry. So the way we get at that, I'm sorry, I'm not advancing my slides. So I'm gonna wrap up here pretty quick. So that's the high road. It's taking the high road rather than the low road. The low road is a sweated race to the bottom on low wages and externalized environmental costs. We take the high road. And the way we get there is by planning for a just transition. And that language is frightening to a lot of people. It means a lot of different things. To us, let me say that we are framing it in the broadest way possible. And it's the lesson from ERA that the green economy isn't just going to happen. And it's not just going to happen equitably if we don't plan for it. So we need to bring everyone along. I'm encouraging you, and I think we're all trying to do this, but it's very, very hard work, but to not get caught in the blue-green fights, right? We have to target both incumbent workers in traditional fossil industries whose jobs may be disrupted, as well as frontline communities who have never had access to decent jobs in the first place. We're thinking about both of those things in a just transition. You might be thinking coal or oil and gas, but the transition to carbon neutrality is also in every other industry. For us, it is about, we're framing it as a kind of economy where the health and the economic benefits of carbon neutrality, which is how we talk about it, accrues to everyone, and especially those people who are designing and building and running that new economy. So that's how we frame it. And that transition, there's a few things there I've listed up here on my slide. These are 5 areas of work which we are convening massive partnerships to tackle. And I'm happy to talk about the work in any one of these buckets, but I would like to say before we move on that that there are a number of just transition principles which also come out of the earlier experience that are true for federal and state investments, right? So the first thing is that jobs, it is not a one-to-one transition. We've got to stop counting jobs. I mean, it's a good political point to say there's as many solar jobs as there are coal jobs, but the labor market doesn't work like that. Coal workers aren't going to go do those solar jobs necessarily, right? We need to think broadly. So let's stop comparing numbers of jobs. Although we can talk more about why we need to know where the jobs are going to be in order to plan for them, but not the abstract jobs calculus. That doesn't serve us well. I think we need to talk more about job quality and the fact that if we care about equity, we cannot deliver equity without paying attention to job quality. Taking folks who are marginalized in 1,000 ways or who are losing their jobs and connecting them to low-wage, dead-end jobs is not equity. So we are pretty clear about the job quality thing. We have to think beyond training. And I've said this before, but I think people think just transition is a workforce solution. We think it's not. It's about economic diversification, because if you're training people for, there aren't any good jobs to train people for, then you're not making a transition. That's just, right? So thinking a lot about economic diversification. This looks different in every single region, and we're pretty clear that it has to be determined regionally, that regions have to, and communities have to design their own future. And we can, part of the way we are thinking about investing money is it's really important to set up regions and communities to have their own determined conversation about what that looks like. We can help with some tools and some parameters, but our job at the state is to set the table, not to say what happens at that table. It looks different in every industry, and we're talking about multiple industries. I think also, as I mentioned, it's important to keep in mind 2 very different stakeholder groups with very different needs and interests, and those are folks who are in danger of losing their jobs and folks who are currently haven't had access historically to any kind of good jobs. And the last thing is that this is a long game, right? People want answers right now. We're in an economic depression, which is, or recession actually, that is difficult and painful, and people are hurting. But to get to an economic recovery in the short term, a lot of this we have to do, it is a long game. It is 5-10 year planning game. So we have to do that at the same time we pay attention to what we need on the ground right now. So that's a lot. Those are a lot of things. I'm happy to talk about any of them, but I do think that if we can avoid some of those early missteps about just asking for training and think that's going to change the world, then I think we'll do a lot better. So I'll stop there and welcome questions probably at the end. I'm curious to hear the specific place-based discussion that Molly will lead.
Wow, thank you, Dr. Sara White. That was excellent presentation. I've been hearing a lot of presentations that are all very good, but this was a little different. I have several questions that I want to ask, but I'm gonna hold off on my impulse here and turn it over to Molly, so she has also ample time to present. And then I see one in the chat that I've already taken note of, so a question. I also have a couple. Any case, so thank you so much, Sarah. That was great. Molly, my good friend, Molly Cripps, if you're up, you're good to go.
So thanks to everyone for hosting us this evening, and a special thank you to Jason Carney. He is the one who extended the invitation to me to join you all tonight, and it's nice to see faces and also some of the names that have cropped up. I recognize folks from having engaged with you all over the years as Tdac stakeholders, so I'm glad to see the turnout tonight. And as Jason well knows from having worked with me over the years, I am a night owl, so anything that happens after sundown, I'm all for. So I'll be happy to join y'all anytime y'all want to do something. During the day's fine, but in the evenings, those are my witching hours. So I will share my screen here, and I have just a few slides. I'm getting a prompt that says host disabled participant screen sharing.
I have your slides up. I can share my screen if that would be easier, so we don't have to pass back and forth.
Sure.
That's
That
okay.
would be great. I would appreciate that. And yes, I'll just let you know when to advance.
Okay, sounds good. Let me know if you see it, everyone.
We see it.
Great.
All right, great. Thanks, you all. So as Alex noted, I'm with the Tennessee Department of Environment and Conservation. The division I oversee is the Office of Energy Programs. So to make a connection to what the Office of Energy Program does in stimulus, I want to talk about what we focus on currently and then programs that we ran back during the Recovery Act during the Obama administration. Our Office of Energy Programs, and I'll refer to it as OEP, provides education and outreach, technical assistance, and/or funding or financing. Funding or financing can be your grants, rebates, loans, bond programs. And we focus on several. All right.
Sorry about that, everyone.
That is okay. I'm not sure what all folks heard and where we got to, because I wasn't aware that I was muted.
Sorry, I muted everyone whenever I heard a sound.
Okay. Oh, I think that I had gotten to, if you can go to the first slide. Yes, I think what I had gotten to was covering the focus areas: energy efficiency, energy management, renewable energy, and energy security planning, preparedness, and response, and also energy and transportation. And through these activities, we are focused on efficient and effective use of energy to enhance the environmental and economic health of the state. I've included our webpage there in case anybody would like any more information. Next slide, please. Continuing on with the About Tdac Office of Energy Programs, note that we do serve as the Governor-designated State Energy Office for the state of Tennessee. What that means is that we work alongside the U.S. Department of Energy. In fact, they're our primary source of funding, and it's through their state energy program. And the state energy program provides funding and technical assistance to all the states, territories, and the District of Columbia. So we have counterparts in all of the states, territories, and DC as well. And through our programs, we advance state-led energy initiatives. And hopefully, we're all maximizing the benefits of decreasing energy waste. Next slide, please. And why I'm making that connection to the U.S. Department of Energy will be apparent on this slide. So back during the Recovery Act, as I'll call it, or ARA, throughout this presentation, there were a number of those programs that were operated by state energy offices. The most significant program, at least for Tennessee, was State Energy Program ARA. And why we make the ARA distinction there is we do receive annual formula funding. So this was our annual formula funding. I don't even want to say that it was on steroids. It was, just so much more in terms of funding that we had to deal with, which we were glad to do. but it was a lot to take in. Then there was another program, Energy Efficiency Conservation Block Grant, that many of you on the phone may have heard of, or excuse me, on the Zoom may have heard of. We pushed out funding not only to our local parks, but also to well over 140 communities in Tennessee under that program. And that was in addition to the funding that went directly to our large local governments. And then the State Energy Efficient Appliance Rebate Program. Another was Energy Assurance or Energy Security, ARA, and that was largely for technical assistance to be utilized at the State Energy Office. In addition to that, Qualified Energy Conservation Bonds. Next slide, please. So the bulk of state energy offices across the state and territory energy offices ran all those programs. Note that some of those offices also oversee, the Weatherization Assistance Program, or LIHEAP, that some of you all might be familiar with. So having the additional funding come through ARA was created many, points of stress for state energy offices. Here, I'll give you a snapshot of what Tennessee State Energy Office focused on and how much funding we were dealing with. Our annual formula funding under State Energy Program, about the 2009 timeframe, was just a little over $500,000. SEPR was $62.4 million. Energy Efficiency Conservation Block Grant was $13.8 million. State Energy Efficient Appliance Rebate Program was $5.3 million. Energy Assurance ARA $500,000, and Qualified Energy Conservation Bonds $64.6 million. So if you can imagine going from annual funding of just over $500,000 to your book of business, so to speak, is well over $120 million. And I'll note that we didn't have more than 10 staff at that time. And then a lot of those folks on staff decided, gosh, it's time to retire. We're going to pack it in now. And so we had to figure out, or at least my predecessor did, how to bring more people on board to operate these programs. At the same time, the state administration was saying, oh, we're not going to staff up to run these programs. Y'all will just have to figure this out. What did that mean? That meant finding partners, the University of Tennessee, Tennessee Tech, others who could step in and augment our staff so that we could get dollars out the door. This was also compounded by the fact, and as Dr. White noticed, you had an administration who, well-meaning, didn't take into consideration some of these constraints. They sold this as a jobs creation act, which it was supposed to be, and I'll cover that in a few more slides. But when you are increasing funding for, and the Office of Energy Programs was certainly not the only division at the state to have experienced this, it's very difficult to be able to program these dollars and implement those programs within the time frame set forth. So we had various periods of performance that we were having to contend with. Next slide, please. The ARA compliance requirements and audits were where we spent so much time of our time, who were the folks who were operating these programs. I will note that I came on board, I was hired in 2010. My background is as an attorney. I didn't have an energy background. I was hired to tackle audits. I was hired to tackle all the compliance requirements of those various programs that I noted on the prior screen. So the first item I want to cover here is periods of performance. So all of the programs I highlighted for you had a specific period of performance. So they had different start dates. They had different end dates. Some you might have been able to get an extension on. Others you were not. If you were not able to spend down the dollars to push those out in your communities within that time period, we were never able to draw those down from the federal government. So you wound up having a lot of staff members who were literally having to exhaust themselves And by that, I mean, 70-hour weeks, sometimes 80-hour weeks, working weekends, forgoing vacations, time with family, etc., to make sure we were programming those dollars and getting the maximum amount out the door in Tennessee. So those periods of performance were just a bit tight, but I'm happy to report that we certainly did a very good job in Tennessee with this. I know a lot of other states who struggled right along with us. So that's one reason why Ara got a black eye. Dr. White had mentioned another one, but those periods of performance, and I think the American people and Congress even having the expectation that things were going to happen a lot sooner than they could. The compliance requirements, Davis-Bacon labor requirements applied to all of the programs. And I'm certainly not knocking what that requires. It requires fair wages that are determined by the Department of Labor, but those are also based on, it's county by county. So every project we worked on, if we were doing when we were doing compliance, we had to make sure that certain labor classifications matched up and that they were being paid the correct wage and that the paperwork was being provided. So I would have loved to have spent more time providing technical assistance to a very small town under a population of 1,000 who needed help installing solar panels. But I was having to focus on Davis-Bacon because it was part of the compliance package with ARA. Buy American, the Recovery Act provision. Those of you on the phone who may be familiar with the Buy American Act, requiring mainly that American iron and steel be utilized in federally funded programs. The Recovery Act put a bit of a twist on this. So there were lots of hurdles to jump over to make sure that we were purchasing the right equipment and that our grantees were complying with Buy American. So lots of paperwork here. We also had to report out on jobs creation and retention on a quarterly basis. This sounds pretty easy, but if you're dealing with hundreds of grantees who are then employing installers or folks to do building energy retrofits, then they've got to report those numbers. So then you have to roll them up. Extremely time consuming. The National Environmental Protection Act. These funds also had to comply with that. Those familiar with the National Environmental Protection Act, you also may be aware that certain federal departments will have what they call categorical exclusions or lists to say if you do X and you do it this way, you're complying with the National Environmental Protection Act. Other activities fall outside that, so you have to go through the environmental assessment process or things along those lines, and hopefully we'll receive findings of no significant impact. So those are incredibly time-consuming, again, very worthwhile, very necessary, but that added an extra layer to the Recovery Act projects. Historic preservation. This is another layer of ARA, but as well with lots of other federal funding sources. So we had to make sure that the buildings that we were retrofitting could have these retrofits performed. If they fell under certain historic preservation rules, we could not. We could make different modifications or no modifications. Audits, 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 and more audits. So what happened from 2010 when I joined the office up through the end of the Recovery Act, which would have been in 2014. We had consecutive and concurrent audits. So I think the most we had going at one time was probably 3, if not 4. And then as soon as we would wrap up audits, there would be another audit start. The Office of Management and Budget at the federal government level, they require A133 single audits for those who receive federal funding over a certain dollar amount. And because of the influx of the ARA dollars, our state comptroller's office found themselves having more work, more audits to conduct. And then the U.S. Department of Energy Office of Inspector General. We had a performance audit with them. And then the U.S. Department of Energy also conducted financial audits. And then there were state performance audits. You may be familiar with the fact that each state agency various state boards undergo performance audits, or sunset audits is what they're called, every several years, so that the General Assembly will have a better idea of how the division or the department or the board is performing. So this was a significant lift for the State Energy Office. And again, keep in mind, as I said, they had originally like 10 employees and a number retired, and then they brought a bunch of new folks on board. So a lot there to tackle. And I haven't even covered what we did with those dollars in the communities, the grants that we pushed out to local governments, to state parks, to businesses, et cetera. But just focusing on all of this, it required a lot of staff time. Next slide, please. So lessons learned from ARA. And I say that these are lessons learned not just for the Tennessee State Energy Office, but as I've spoken with my counterparts across the U.S., as well as folks that I worked with at DOE during ARA and am still working with now on current projects, as well as the National Association of State Energy Officials. Staff and personal capacity. Be realistic with what can be accomplished with existing personnel. Understand the benefits of augmenting staff capacity. States want to receive this funding. Local governments want to receive this funding, but you have to have personnel to oversee the programs. Otherwise, you find yourself in trouble on the back end with an audit. And so when I speak about augmenting staff capacity, that can be through partnerships. I mentioned, of course, the University of Tennessee and Tennessee Tech that we worked with back during the Recovery Act. We had other programs that I haven't highlighted on those slides where we engaged with a number of nonprofits in Tennessee to focus on energy education and pushing that out across the state. So those organizations exist. It's being aware of who you can get in contact with, who you can work with. And I think in Tennessee and also across the Southeast, we have a lot of different organizations. And Alex, I'm very glad to have been introduced to you. I think certainly your organization is one that I know we can rely on as we're looking at what may come to Tennessee and in the Southeast in terms of stimulus funding. Another lesson learned is all those compliance requirements that I walked through is folks at the federal level need to recognize that these are a heavy lift. And we know locally and at the state level, audit findings are going to result if these are not handled properly. So keep those things in mind when you are determining what a period of performance should be for a particular project. We can't work magic. We all tried to, just not possible. And the last lesson learned I will highlight here, although there are many more, is shovel-ready projects. And as I say, I'm still looking for these unicorns. I hear about shovel-ready projects all the time. And it's not that someone may not be ready to go and have plans, engineering, design, all of that taken care of. But when they're tapping a funding source that layers on Davis-Bacon, that layers on Buy American, that layers on NEPA, they're no longer shovel-ready. And they're not going to be shovel-ready for months, because of those compliance hoops that we must jump through. So this is simply an item I want to point to in terms of setting expectations. Understand that pumping these dollars into the states to then be pumped out and into the economy, it's not going to be overnight. It's not going to be over a matter of a few months. It's going to be over a matter of several years. And so as long as we understand what expectations should be, I think we will be more successful in the event we are able to move forward with another stimulus in the Biden administration. Next slide, please. So I'd like to highlight before closing and us moving to questions and answer session on what energy offices are looking at in terms of stimulus priorities and our National Association of State Energy Officials, what they're focusing on. I don't mean that these are the only topics that we are hoping that we would see funding for, but these are the areas where we think we are most likely to see funding. So the first is grid modernization. And so think about the electrical infrastructure. but also think about the natural gas infrastructure. Some of you may remember that during the Obama administration, the DOE walked through a process called the Quadrennial Energy Review. I don't think it would be a bad idea to dust off a couple of those reports because they contain great information in them in terms of areas that need to be looked into and where we need to improve our infrastructure and also our distribution, or excuse me, our transmission and our distribution, and not just focus on the electrical grid side. In addition to grid or infrastructure modernization, buildings is another one. So on the commercial side, I think many of you probably heard the Biden administration's comment that they are hopeful that they would be able to impact 4 million buildings during his administration. And then in terms of residential, 2 million homes with low-income weatherization projects. Beyond this, we really don't have any specifics at this point. How would these programs work? How would they be pushed out? Would it be through the Department of Energy? Would it be through HUD, et cetera? But buildings we know will be a focus. Next is transportation. There's so much going on in this space already. And in Tennessee, this is where a lot of our focus has been under our state energy office has been in energy and transportation. So we are primed and ready to go in any of these categories, but definitely transportation. Some of you may have seen our announcement last week where we noted that we are partnering with TVA and also with the Department of Transportation in Tennessee, and we will be focusing on the creation of a statewide electric vehicle fast charging infrastructure network. And so if folks need any more information on that, happy to answer questions, but I wanted to highlight that here as a number of states have those projects that they're already moving forward on, but certainly having more funding to work with, we'll be able to do even greater things. And the last one I want to highlight is workforce development. And you heard from Dr. Pyatt about this, and certainly she is much more qualified to address workforce development than I am. But I will note that I agree with all of the comments that she made during her presentation as to what we didn't get right during ARA or the Recovery Act, and steps we can take to avoid getting that black eye again this go around, at least in terms of regard to workforce development. We know in all of these focus areas that there are jobs, and there are going to be more jobs, and these are better paying jobs, and these are jobs that require different skills than folks may have at this time. So in terms of the workforce development, we need to focus on those, what some may refer to now as old technologies, and convert workers, or some of the workers that are focused on those older technologies, and move them toward the newer technologies. We have great networks in Tennessee to be able to focus on this already. Our colleges of applied technology, also looking at our community colleges and needing to know what we can also do at the high school level. I think we've certainly seen a resurgence of these types of skilled labor courses in high schools in the last several years. I know when I was in high school in Tennessee, that was frankly the focus of my high school. They were more focused on those programs than they were with sending people to college. So, but glad to see that those are back in our high schools, because I think they're going to be critical to what we need to focus on in the coming years with workforce development, in addition to those colleges of applied technology and community colleges. So I think I may possibly have, made it to the end of my slide deck. Yes, I have. So everyone, thank you again for the opportunity to be here with you this evening. I appreciate that very much and look forward to questions and answers. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Molly. Another outstanding presentation. We're almost at the hour here. Daniel, are we going till 7:30 East Central Time, or does it end now?
We were scheduled for 7, but because we had some tech problems, if our presenters don't mind staying on a little long to answer some questions, that would be great.
I'm glad to stay on, Dan. Other than taking my puppy out in a bit, I'm good to go.
I'm
good
a fellow night person, Molly. Okay. So I'm going to read a question for you. There's several, but you know, I think more than we can cover on. But I'm going to read one for you and then one for Dr. White as well. But this one's for you since you just finished your presentation. From Brianna Kinsley, are there ways to cut that red tape? Are there ways that red tape could be cut to improve deployment of federal funds, especially to diverse disadvantaged groups, without compromising important standards and accountability? And somebody else asked a similar question.
Yes and no. The National Association of State Energy Officials has been working quite closely with various congressional appropriators and also different staff members. One thing that they have been focusing on are the various compliance items that I mentioned. We will not be able to get rid of them. Let's just say that the unions come out in droves if anyone talks about getting rid of Davis-Bacon. Various and sundry other associations come out in droves if anyone talks about getting rid of the Buy American provision. And there are great things that come out of having those attached to our programming. As various environmental associations and departments would speak out against getting rid of NEPA for certain projects. They're very important, but I think that as long as folks understand that we have to jump over those hurdles and are not expecting these dollars to be able to be pushed out into communities within a month after legislation passing, then we will all be better off. There are certain programs that we are hopeful, say, for instance, weatherization assistance program, because that is focused on low-income housing. We are hopeful that the appropriators, when they are working through pulling together what may go toward different programs under a stimulus, is that they might be able to treat some programs a bit differently. So those conversations are being held. I don't want to leave anyone with the expectation that we would wind up seeing 50 different flavors of the stimulus. That's not the goal of those conversations that various national associations are holding with appropriators. But it is to address what can we do to clean that up and to make these a little more efficient to run these programs and less of a struggle for folks at the state level and the local government level to push the dollars out. So I apologize that that's not an answer of a yes or no, but just know that folks are concerned about that. And I have confidence in the folks at the National Association of State Energy Officials to carry that message, whether or not it will result in seeing less of the compliance burden, I don't know.
Awesome, thank you. And for Sara, Dr. White, I have one for you. Somebody asked, what do you think of policies of beefing up AmeriCorps? And I just want to add one question of mine as well, if you could just elaborate a little bit more of thinking beyond training. The training element is something that, yeah, you touched upon, you went pretty fast, and I'd like a little bit more detail on that. Thank you so much.
Sure. I just like to first just say, in response to Molly's wise words and the question there, when you hear about the audits and audits and audits, this is why people hate government, right? Because it just feels crazy. And yet at the same time, then it leads people to want to disinvest. But as she said so eloquently, if we don't have the folks in government in order to organize this stuff, then we can't get it done, right? So I think it is this very critical question, the earlier question about how we ensure quality standards and accountability and transparency. At the same time, we don't just bog ourselves down in regulatory red tape, right? And it's a hard question. One of the ways that I think about that, and you might want to talk to other folks in your state about, is for all these programs, whenever you send money out, you have to put sort of a data gathering and evaluation piece included in that funding and at the start. You can't go later and figure out how to count the jobs, for example. You have to have a mechanism to gather that data before you even spend $1. And that way it's not hard to get the results. But if you have to go backwards and try and get, and it's a tricky thing to do, there's a lot of ways to do it, but if we want to get good evaluations about what's working and what's not, then we have to spend the money on that up front. And people are they don't want to spend money on administration, which means staff, and they don't want to spend money on administration, which means evaluation. But without those things, we are just shooting in the dark. So I just wanted to support, what Molly was saying about the need for, state governments have played an impossible role here in the middle. And that could happen again, right? If unrealistic expectations. So that's about that earlier question. I think what's the new question? I'm sorry. Workforce development, but before that,
think of policies of beefing up AmeriCorps.
Right. Yeah. Well, that's a complicated question. I don't know. There's always, we have in California something called the Conservation Corps, modeled on, WPA programs. One of the challenges with public programs is, do you, in engaging people, what do you do when have a public sector program that is going to put a lot of people to work, but is that undercutting wages and jobs for other people in the economy? What does that look like? In some ways, it's a great entree, but so there's two issues with, and I don't know the specific mechanisms of AmeriCorps, but I know programs like that. There's two issues. One is folks go in and have a good experience, but they don't come out the other side connected to jobs in the labor market. They just go in and have a good experience doing their thing for 1 or 2 years. And so in some ways, we want it to be a training and a launching place for local people to learn and move into careers. So that's one of the challenges with those kinds of programs. The other is, I do think that we should have more public jobs programs, and hopefully there'll be money to do it. But how do we do that in a way that actually doesn't compete with businesses and workers who are trying to earn a living doing that, right? When other people are having subsidized wages doing it. So there's some real challenges there, but I think they're creative and interesting programs, and just need to be thought through a little harder.
Excellent, thank you. I'm going to go back to Miss Molly here and try to weave in a few questions in one, just in the interest of time. But you mentioned you had to partner with universities. Later in your presentation, you also mentioned out of necessity. Later, you mentioned nonprofits. Somebody asked about, and I have the same question, about community groups being more participants, also the type of universities that you work with. And then somebody asked about, will the broadband initiative be added around on this time? And then finally, there's questions about the staffing at TDEC. What is the makeup of the staffing, and also are they trained to engage and deal with these issues? And finally, I know it's a lot, Molly, somebody asked about the Justice 40 initiative and if it affects funding.
Okay, so take it from the top, Alex. Remind me of the first topic.
First topic, the type of partners that you had, universities,
yes.
And you mentioned nonprofits, and there's questions about community groups. And can you delve a little bit more into that? Yeah.
Yes, I will. So under the Recovery Act, our main partner was the University of Tennessee. They assisted us with two main projects. One, some of you all may remember, is the Tennessee Solar Initiative. And we worked with UT to run those programs, as well as to do the West Tennessee Solar Farm. So those of you who travel I-40 between Nashville and Memphis might be familiar with the solar farm that is right off of the north side of 40. At the time it was built, it was the largest solar farm in the Southeast. It was the largest on TDEC's system. It's 5 megawatts. That's tiny now. So UT assisted us with that since we didn't have the staffing numbers at the office. We wound up working through UT. I'm not certain exactly of the genesis of that relationship. I wasn't at the office at that time. But I do know that they had personnel on board, and also the connectivity to the Oak Ridge National Labs through certain partnerships. So I think that was what drove that relationship with UT, was actually their relationship with the lab. And then Tennessee Tech, working with them, they also oversee a DOE-funded program, the Industrial Assessment Centers. Dr. Glenn Cunningham there has run that program for a number of years. And so we worked with Dr. Cunningham and his staff to, he was one of our main educators in terms of reaching commercial and industrial end users through our Tennessee Energy Education Initiative items that we did under the Recovery Act. We did also engage with a number of different universities throughout the Recovery Act, but I would say it would have been more as a, on the stakeholder end instead of, pushing funding through or tapping them to assist with the operations of the program. We did that with a number of different persons at Vanderbilt, also the University of Memphis, as well as Austin Peay and ETSU. We do have very good relationships at present with all of our state-funded universities, as well as a number of the private universities in Tennessee. It might be through different channels. It might be through the Sustainability Office, or for others, it might be through their R&D groups, or as I noted with Tennessee Tech, the Industrial Assessment Center. So we do have the connections there. It just might not be the right person, but in the event we do have stimulus dollars flowing to Tennessee and to the State Energy Office, then we'll be able to reach out and work with those partners. We would certainly consider community partners as well. Definitely need to work with community partners in order to conduct the outreach that we would need to with such programs to get the word out so that folks understand what we are doing with the programs, how we are putting the dollars to use. In terms of working with community programs to then push the dollars out, as we've talked about with all those compliance requirements, that community group would need to have someone on board who can do all that. And some community groups do, and some community groups don't. And so what happens at our level also happens at the grantee level. We get audited, you get audited. If we're having to fill out the forms on job retention, you're having to fill those out. We're running them, rolling them up and aggregating them across the program. So community groups are a very important part of any programmatic operation, I think, and certainly we'd love to be able to work with as many as we possibly can, and certainly to inform us in terms of where we think that the dollars should be spent in Tennessee and on what. And I know there were a couple of others, Alex, if you could remind me of those.
Nah, Molly, to be honest with you, it's almost a quarter past the hour. So
Okay.
I'm gonna propose that we wrap this up, and thank you for your patience and going over. I'm gonna make a proposal here to Daniel. I am the executive director of the Southeast Climate and Energy Network. We have several working groups. One of those is called the Fresh Energy Group, which deals with these type of issues and others. I'm gonna try to bring you both, maybe in separate calls, to give our members more time to ask you questions. And Daniel, through you, will invite everybody here, even if they're not part of our network, to participate. So just give us, 6 weeks to 2 months maybe to make this happen. And I think the timing of maybe those presentations, and again, I'm assuming and foolishly that you would say yes, but I'm hoping that you will, both of you. And yeah, but we can't keep you any longer. It's 8:15 Eastern time. It's super late.
Okay.
This has been great, and we need to hear more of this this perspective and where you folks work. So thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Sara and Molly. Awesome. And thanks for your patience with the technological issues.
Thanks for the opportunity. Bye-bye.
Bye, y'all.